Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to Hot Technologies. Yes, indeed, of 2016. We're in year 3 of this show. It's very exciting stuff. We've been rocking and rolling this year. This is Eric Cavanaugh, your host. The topic for today, this is a great topic. It has lots of application all across a number of industries, quite frankly. Who, what, where, and how, why you want to know. Yes, indeed. We're going to talk all about that fun stuff. There's a spot about yours truly. Hit me up on Twitter at Eric_Cavanaugh. I try to retweet all mentions and retweet anything someone sends to me otherwise. So the year is hot. Yes, indeed. The whole show here is designed to help organizations and individuals understand particular kinds of technology. So we designed the whole program here, Hot Technologies, as a way of defining a particular kind of software or a particular trend or a particular kind of technology. And the reason is because, frankly, in the software world, you'll often get these marketing terms that get bandied about, and sometimes they can, frankly, bastardize the concepts they were intended to describe. So in this show, we're really trying to help you understand what a particular kind of technology is, how it works, when you can use it, when you should not use it perhaps, and give you as much detail as we possibly can. So we'll have 3 presenters today. Our very own Robin Bloor, Chief Analyst here at the Bloor Group, our data scientist calling in from Sydney, Australia, on the other side of the planet, Des Blanchfield, and one of our favorite guests, Bullett Manale, Director of Sales Engineering at IDERA. I'll just say a couple things here. Understanding who is doing what with which piece of data, well, that's kind of like governance, right? So if you think about all of the regulations around industries like healthcare and financial services, well, in those domains, that stuff is incredibly important. You need to know who touched the information, who changed something, who accessed it, who uploaded it, for example, what's the lineage, what's the provenance of this data, and you can rest assured all of these issues are going to remain prominent in the years to come for all kinds of reasons, not just for compliance, though HIPAA and Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank and all these regulations are very significant, but also just so that you understand in your business who's doing what, where, when, why, and how. So this is good stuff. We're going to be paying attention. Go ahead, take it away, Robin Bloor.
Okay, well, thanks for that introduction, Eric. This area of governance is, governance in IT wasn't a word that you heard until a little after the year 2000, I think, and it came about primarily because, I think anyway, it came about primarily because of various compliance legislation that was going on, particularly HIPAA and Sarbanes-Oxley, but there's actually a lot of it. And therefore, organizations realized that they had to have a set of rules and a set of procedures because it was necessary under the law to do that. But long before that, particularly in the banking sector, there were various initiatives that you had to obey depending upon what kind of bank you were, and particularly the international bankers. The whole of the Basel compliance started way, way before that particular set of initiatives after the year 2000. But it all really comes down under governance. So I thought I would talk around the subject of governance as an introduction to the focus of keeping an eye on who's getting at the data. Data governance, it was like, I used to look around about, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, look around for definitions of it, and it wasn't well defined at all. And it's become clearer and clearer as to what it actually means. But the reality of the situation was that within certain limits, all data was actually previously governed, but there were no formal rules for it. And there were special rules that were made, particularly in the banking industry, for doing stuff like that. But again, that was just more about compliance, as in one way or another, proving that you were actually it's kind of associated with risk. So it's proving that you were a viable bank was a deal. If you look at the governance challenge now, it starts with the fact of the big data movement. We've got an increasing number of data sources, and data volume, of course, is an issue with that. But in particular, we've started to do much more with unstructured data. It's started to become something that is part of the whole of the analytics game. And because of analytics, data provenance and lineage is now important. Really, from the point of view of using data analytics in any way related to any kind of compliance, you really do have to have knowledge of where the data came from and how it got to be what it is. Data encryption started to become an issue. It became a bigger issue as soon as we went to Hadoop, because the idea of a data lake in which you throw a lot of data suddenly means that you have a huge area of vulnerability if people can get at it. So the encryption of data became much more prominent. Authentication was always an issue, but in the older environments, particularly the mainframe environment, they had such wonderful perimeter security protection that authentication was never really much of an issue. Later on, it became a big issue, and it's much more of an issue now because we've got such hugely distributed environments. Data access monitoring, that became an issue. I seem to remember various tools coming into existence about 10 years ago, and I think most of those were driven by compliance initiatives. And therefore, we've also got all of the compliance rules, compliance reporting. The thing that's come to mind is that even back in the 1990s, when you were doing clinical trials in the pharmaceuticals industry, you not only had to be able to prove where the data came from. I mean, obviously, it's very important if you're trying out drugs on in various contexts to know who is being tried on and what the contextual data around that. But you had to be able to create, you had to be able to provide an audit of the software that actually created the data. It's the most severe piece of compliance I've ever seen anywhere in terms of proving that you aren't actually messing things up deliberately or accidentally. And then in recent times, particularly, data lifecycle management has become an issue. And all of these are in a way challenges because a lot of these have not been done well, and in a lot of circumstances it's necessary to do them. This is what I call the data pyramid. I've kind of talked through this before, but I find it a very interesting way of looking at things. You can think of data as having layers. Raw data, if you like, are really just signals or measurements, recordings, events, single records mostly, or possibly transactions. Calculations and aggregations, of course, create new data, and they can be thought of at the level of data. Above that, once you actually connect data together, it becomes information. It becomes more useful, but of course it becomes more vulnerable to people hacking it or abusing it. And I define that as being created really through the structuring of data, being able to visualize the data, having glossaries, schemas, various ontologies on the information. And those two lower layers are what we process in one way or another, but above that is what I call the layer of knowledge, consisting of rules, policies, guidelines, procedures, some of which may actually be created by insights discovered in analytics. But a lot of them are actually just policies that you have to abide by. And this is the layer, if you like, of governance. This is where, in one way or another, if this layer isn't properly populated, then the two layers below it are not being managed. And the final point about this is understanding is something that resides only in human beings. Computers haven't managed to do that yet, thankfully. Otherwise, I'd be out of a job. The governance empire, I kind of put this together, I think it must have been about 9 months ago, possibly a lot earlier than that, but basically I've kind of enhanced it, but as soon as we started to get concerned about governance, then there was, you know, in terms of the corporate data hub, there was not just data reservoir or data lake, but there's also general data servers of various sorts and specialist data servers, all of which needed to be governed. And when you actually looked at the various dimensions, well, you know, data security, data cleansing, metadata discovery and metadata management, creating a business glossary, data mapping, data lineage, data lifecycle management, and then performance monitoring, management, service level management, system management, which you might not actually associate with governance, but a certain, now that we're going to a faster and faster world with more and more data flows, actually being able to do something in a particular, with a particular performance is actually a necessity and starts to become a rule of operation rather than anything else. So summarizing in terms of the growth of compliance, I've watched this happen over many, many years, but the general data protection actually came in the 1990s in Europe, and it's just got more and more sophisticated since then. And then all of these things started to get introduced or being made more sophisticated. GRC, that's governance, risk and compliance, has been going on since the banks did Basel. ISO has been creating standards of various sorts of operations. I know for all the time that I've been in IT, which is a long time, US government has been particularly active in creating various legislation, the SOX, there's Gramm-Leach, Belisle, HIPAA, FISMA, FERPA. You've also got the wonderful NIST organization that creates many standards, particularly security standards that are very useful. And the data protection laws in Europe have local variances. What you can do with personal data in Germany, for example, is different than what you can do in, I don't know, the Slovakian Republic or Slovenia or whatever. And they introduced recently, and I just thought I'd mention this because I find it amusing, Europe is introducing the idea of the right to be forgotten. That is that there ought to be a statute of limitations on data that has been public that actually is personal data. I think that's hilarious. From an IT point of view, that's going to be very, very difficult if it starts to become effective legislation. So in summary, I would say the following, you know, because IT and data management are evolving quickly, governance must also evolve quickly, and it applies to all of the areas of governance. And having said that, I'll pass the ball to Des.
Yes, indeed. So Des Blanchfield, take it away. And Robin, I'm with you, man. I'm dying to see how this right to be forgotten plays out, because I think it's not just going to be challenging, but basically impossible. And it's just, it's a violation waiting to be exercised upon by government agencies. Des, take it away.
It is indeed, and that's a topic for another discussion. We have a very similar challenge here in Asia Pacific, and particularly Australia, where carriers and ISPs are required to log everything related to internet and be able to recall it and regurgitate it in case somebody of interest does something wrong. And it is a law, and you have to comply with it. And the challenge, just as somebody in Google in the USA might get told to delete my search history or whatever it might be to comply with European law, particularly German privacy law. In Australia, if an agency wants to look into a carrier, has to be able to provide details of calls and search history you've made, which is challenging. But it is the world we live in, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. So let me just jump into mine. So I deliberately made my title page hard to read. You've got to really look hard at that text. Compliance, conforming to a set of rules, specifications, controls, policies, standards, or laws with a fairly messy background. And that's because you've got to really look at it hard to get the detail and pull out the information from what it's overlaid on, which is sort of a series of tables and rows and columns inside a database schema mock-up in Visio. Because that's what compliance it sort of feels like day to day. It's quite hard to dive into the detail and pull out the relevant bits of information you need to be able to confirm that you are compliant, report on that, monitor it and test it. In fact, I thought a really good way to visualize this when we ask ourselves the question, are you compliant? Are you sure? Well, prove it. There's a really fun thing that is perhaps a little bit more Anglo-Celtic, but I'm sure it's made its way around the world into the US, and it's where's Wally? And Wally's a little character that gets into these cartoon drawings in the form of books, and usually very large-scale pictures of A3 or bigger. So, you know, table-sized drawings. And he's a little character that wears a beanie and a red and white striped shirt. And the idea of the game is you look at this picture and you go round and round in circles and you try and find Wally, and he's in that picture there somewhere. And so when you think about how to discover and describe and report on compliance, in many ways it's like playing Where's Wally. And if you look at that picture, it's almost impossible to find the character, and children spend hours on it. And I have to admit, I had a lot of fun doing it myself yesterday. And when we look at it, we find a whole bunch of people in these cartoons that have been deliberately placed there with similar pieces of the Wally outfit of a striped beanie and jersey or woolen top, but they tend to be false positives. And this is a similar challenge we have with compliance, that when we're looking at things, sometimes something that we think is the case isn't the case at all. Somebody might have access to a database, and they're supposed to have that access to the database, but the way in which they're using it is slightly different from what we expect, and we might decide that that's something we need to look at. And when we look into it, we find, oh, actually, that's a very valid user, and they're just doing something quirky, and maybe it's a piece of research, or who knows. In other cases, that might be the opposite. And the reality, when I go forward again, there's Wally. And if you looked really hard at this in high resolution, you'd find the one character who is actually wearing the proper attire. All the others are just lookalikes or feel-alikes, and compliance feels very much like that. For most people I know that work in the controls and compliance and policies areas of businesses in a whole range of areas, whether it's technology, whether it's finance, or it's operational and risk, because often it's very hard to kind of see the Wallies of the picture or see the trees for the wood. So the question that we ask ourselves when we think about things like compliance is, well, you know, big deal. What could possibly go wrong if we don't quite meet compliance? Well, in the context of today's discussion, specifically around database and control of access to data, I'm going to give you some very real wake-up call examples of what can go wrong in very short, succinct form. If we think of data breaches, and we're all familiar with data breaches, we hear them in the media and we kind of scoff and laugh because people think, oh, you know, it's personal things, it's you know, Ashley Madison and people who are looking to get dates outside of their relationships and marriages. It's Fling accounts, and there's all these weird things, or some random European or Russian ISP or hosting company gets hacked. But when it gets to things like MySpace and these top 10, when you look at these numbers, what I want you to realize is there's 1.1 billion people's details in these top 10 breaches. And yes, there's overlaps. There's probably people who've got a MySpace account and a Dropbox account and a Tumblr account. But let's just round it up to 1 billion people. So these top 10 breaches of the last decade or so, not even a decade in most cases, sum up approximately 1/7 of the world's population of human beings, but more realistically, about 50% of the number of people who are connected to the internet, over 1 billion individuals. And these come about because compliance hasn't been met in some cases, in most cases, where controls of access to database, controls of access to particular data sets and systems and networks. And so this is a scary reality check. And if it doesn't frighten you when you just look at the top 10 and conceive that this is or consider this as 1 billion individuals, real human beings, just like us, on this call right now, if you've had a LinkedIn account, if you've had a Dropbox account or a Tumblr account, or if you bought some Adobe products or even registered to download the free Adobe Viewer, it's entirely likely, not possible, it's entirely likely that your details, your first name, your last name, your email address, potentially either a work company address or your home address or your credit card, are actually out there because of a breach that took place because of controls that weren't necessarily managed well in the form of data management, data governance. Let's have a look at it when we look at it in real detail. There's one screen of them. There's about 50-something there. There's another 50. There's about another 25. These are data breaches listed on a website called haveibeenpwned.com. So this is what could possibly go wrong if something as simple as controlling who has access to data in databases in different fields and rows and columns and different applications in your business aren't managed properly. Because organizations are now data-driven, and most data lives in a database of some form. And so when you think about that list of breaches that we've just looked at, and hopefully it's given you a bit of a cold shower in a sense, in that you thought, okay, that's very real, and it potentially has impacted you. Because in 2012, breach of LinkedIn, for example. I mean, most professionals have a LinkedIn account these days, and it's likely that your details are lost and have been out on the internet since 2012, and we've only just been told about it in 2016. So what happened with your information in those 4 years? Well, it's interesting, and we can talk about that separately. So database and systems management. I often talk about what I consider the top 5 challenges in managing these things. And at the very, very top, and I'm ranking these in order of preference from myself, but also order of impact. Number 1 is security and compliance. The controls and mechanisms and policies around controlling who has what access to what system for what reason and purpose, and reporting on that, so monitoring it, looking into the systems, looking into the databases and seeing who can actually access records, individual fields and records. And think about this in a very simple form. So let's talk about banking and wealth management as one example. When you sign up for a bank account, let's just say a normal cash account for an FPOS card or a cash account or a check account, you fill in a form and there's lots of very private information in that piece of paper that you fill in, or you do it online, and that goes into a computer system. Now, if somebody in marketing wants to contact you and send you a brochure, they should be allowed to see your first name and last name on your postal address, for example, and potentially your phone number if they want to call you and cold call you and sell you something. But they probably shouldn't see the total amount of money you've got in the bank for a bunch of reasons. But if somebody's looking at you from a risk point of view or trying to help you do something like get better interest rates on your account, that particular person probably wants to see how much money you've got in the bank so they can offer you the appropriate levels of interest return on your money. Those two individuals have very different roles and very different reasons for those roles and purposes of those roles, and as a result need to see different information in your record, but not all of your record. And so there's controls around the different reports or views or screens or forms that they have in the applications that are used to manage your account. And the development of those, the maintenance of those, the administration of those, the reporting around those, and the governance and compliance that are wrapped around those like bubble wrap, all are a very, very large challenge. And that's just the number 1 challenge in managing data and systems. When we go deeper down that stack and with the monitoring and incident detection and response, management and administration of the systems and compliance around them, and design and development of systems for new components, it gets much, much harder. Managing the whole issue of reducing risks and improving security, my top 5 challenges in this space, and I like the imagery that goes with a customs desk when you're entering a country. You present your passport and they check you out and they look at their computer system to see whether you should pass or not, and if you shouldn't, they put you on the next plane back home. Otherwise, they let you back in and they ask you questions like, are you coming on a holiday? Are you here a tourist? Are you here for work? What kind of work are you going to see? Where are you going to stay? How long are you coming for? Have you got enough money to cover your expenses and costs? Are you going to become a risk to the company that you're, the country that you're in, and they might have to look after you and feed you? There are some issues around this space of data management, data protection. For example, in the database space, we need to think about mitigating database bypasses. So if the data is in a database in a normal environment and there's controls and mechanisms around that in the system, what happens if a dump of the data is made in raw SQL and backed up to tape? The databases are dumped in raw form and backed up sometimes. Sometimes it's done for technical reasons, development reasons, but let's just say a DB dump is taken and it's backed up to tape. What happens if I happen to get my hands on that tape and restore it? And I've got a raw copy of the database in SQL. It's an ANSI file, it's text, I can read it. And so all the passwords that are stored in that dump have no control over because I'm now getting access to the actual content of the database without the database engine protecting it. So I can technically bypass the security of the database platform that's being built and engineered with compliance and risk management to stop me looking at the data, because potentially as a developer or system administrator, I've got my hands on a full dump of the database that's used for backups. Misuse of the data, potentially getting somebody to log in as their elevated account and letting me sit at their screen and looking in for information or similar things. Providing auditing of the access and use of the data and viewing of the data or changes to the data, and then the reporting around that control and the compliance required, monitoring the traffic and access and so forth, blocking threats that come from external locations and so forth. For example, if the data is presented via a form on a web page on the internet, have SQL injections being protected through firewalls and content controls. And there's a long, a detailed story that goes behind this. But you can see here that just some of these absolutely fundamental things that we think about in mitigating and managing risk around data inside databases, it's actually relatively easy to get around some of these if you're at different levels of the stack of the technology space. And so the challenge gets harder and harder as we get more and more data and more databases, and more challenging with people having to manage the systems and monitor the use of them and track the relevant detail that specifically pertains to things that Robin spoke about around things like, personal compliance. I mean, individuals have controls and mechanisms around them that comply. If you do something wrong, you could potentially be fired. If I log in as my account and let you see it, that should be a fireable offense. Now I've given you access to data that you shouldn't have seen normally. So there's personal compliance, there's corporate compliance. Companies have policies and rules and controls that they set upon themselves just for ensuring the company runs well and provides a good return on profit and a good return to the investors and shareholders. And then there's often citywide or statewide or national, federal, as you say in the U.S., controls and laws. And then there's global ones, with some of the bigger incidents in the world, the likes of Sarbanes-Oxley, two individuals who are asked to come up with ways on how to protect data and systems. There's Basel in Europe, and there's a whole range of controls in Australia, particularly around stock exchanges and prudential platforms, and then privacy at individual or company level. And when each of these is stacked up, as you saw in one of the slides that Robin had, they become almost a near impossible mountain to climb, and the costs get high. And so we're at the point where the original traditional approach of having human beings measure and control these is no longer an appropriate approach because the scale is too big. And we have a scenario where compliance is what I call now an always-on issue, and that is that we used to potentially have a point in time, either monthly or quarterly or annually, where we review our state of the nation and health of compliance and controls, making sure that certain people had certain access and didn't have certain access depending on what their permissions were. Now it's a case that the speed of things move, the pace at which things change, the scale at which we're operating on. Compliance is an always-on issue, and the global financial crisis was just one example of where that, the relevant controls and measures and security and compliance could have potentially avoided a scenario where we had a runaway freight train of certain behavior, just creating a situation where the entire world effectively nearly went broke and bankrupt. And to do that, we need the right tools. Throwing human beings at the thing, throwing bodies at it's no longer a valid approach because the scale is too big and things are moving too fast. And so the discussion today I think we're going to have is around the types of tools to apply to this. And in particular, the tool set that IDERA can provide to us to do that. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand to Bullett to walk through his material and show us their approach and the tool set they've got to solve this problem that we've tabled now for you. So with that, Bullett, I will hand to you.
Sounds great. Thank you. I want to talk about a few slides, and I also want to show you a product that we use for SQL Server databases specifically to help out with compliance situations. So really the challenge in a lot of cases, I'm going to skip through a few of these. This is just our portfolio of products. I'm going to go through that pretty quickly. But in terms of really where this product's going to address and how it relates to compliance, I always pull up this as like the first slide because it's kind of a generic, hey, what is the responsibility of a DBA? And one of the things is controlling and monitoring user access and also being able to generate reports. And so that's going to tie into when you're talking to your auditor, how difficult that process can be is going to vary depending on if you're going to do it on your own or if you're going to use a third-party tool to help. But generally speaking, when I'm talking to database administrators, a lot of times if they've never been involved in an audit, you kind of have to educate them into really what it is that you really are having to do. And related to what type of compliance that is needing to be fulfilled and being able to prove that you're actually following the rules as it applies to that level of compliance, a lot of people don't get it at first. They think, oh, well, I can just buy a tool that will make me compliant. And the reality is that's not the case. I wish I could say that our product magically, by hitting the easy button, gave you the ability to make sure that you were in compliance. The reality is that you have to have your environment set up in terms of the controls, in terms of how people are accessing the data. That all has to be worked out with your, with the application that you have, where that sensitive data is being stored, what type of regulatory requirement it is, and then also having to work with typically an internal compliance officer as well to be able to make sure you're following all the rules. Now, this sounds really complicated, and if you look at all of these different regulatory requirements, you'd think that would be the case, but the reality is that there is a common denominator here. And in our case, with the tool that I'm going to show you today, the Compliance Manager product, the process in our situation would be that we first and foremost, we need to make sure that we're collecting the audit trail data related to where the data is in the database that's sensitive. Now, you can collect everything, right? I could go out and say, I want to collect every transaction that happens on this database. But the reality is that you probably only have a small fraction or small percentage of transactions that are actually related to the sensitive data. If it's PCI compliance, it's going to be around the credit card information, the owners of the credit cards, their personal information, but there might be a ton of other transactions as it relates to your application that don't really have any bearing on the regulatory requirement of PCI. So from that standpoint, the first thing when I talk to DBAs, I say, the number one challenge isn't trying to get a tool to do these things for you. It's just knowing where is that sensitive data and how are we locking that data down. And if you have that, if you can answer that question, then you're halfway home in terms of being able to show that you're in compliance, assuming you are following the right controls. Now, let's say for a second that you are following the right controls and you've told the auditors that that's the case. The next part of the process is obviously being able to provide an audit trail that shows and validates that those controls are actually working, and then following that up with making sure you save that data. And usually with things like PCI and HIPAA compliance and those types of things, you're talking 7 years worth of retention. So you're talking about a lot of transactions and a lot of data. Now, if you are keeping and collecting every transaction, even though only 5% of the transactions are related to the sensitive data, you're talking about a pretty big cost associated to having to store that data for 7 years. And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, is in getting people's head around that, to say, that's a really unnecessary cost, obviously. And it also, it's a lot easier if we can just focus granularly on those sensitive areas within the database. So in addition to that, you're also going to want controls around some of the sensitive information as well, not just to show in terms of an audit trail, but to also be able to tie things back to actions that are happening and be able to get notified in real time so that you can be made aware of that. And the example I always use is if, and it may not necessarily be related to any type of regulatory requirement, but just being able to track, for example, somebody were to drop the table associated to the payroll. If that happens, the way you find out about it, if you're not tracking that, is nobody gets paid, and that's too late. You want to know when that table gets dropped right when it gets dropped. And so to avoid any bad things that happen as a result of some disgruntled employee going and deleting the table that's tied directly to payroll. So with that said, the trick is finding the common denominator, or using that common denominator, no matter what the level of compliance. And that's kind of what we try to do with this tool. Is we basically take the approach of, we're not going to show you a report that's specific to PCI, that's specific to SOX. The common denominator is you have an application that's using SQL Server to store the sensitive data within the database. And once you kind of get over that and you say, yeah, that's really the main thing we need to focus on, where is that sensitive data and how is it being accessed, that's where, once you have that, then there's a ton of reports that we offer that can provide that proof, if you will, that you're within compliance. Now, going back to the questions that are asked by an auditor, the first question is going to be, who has access to the data and how are they getting that access? Can you prove that the right people are accessing the data and that the wrong people aren't? And can you also prove that the audit trail itself is something that I can trust as an immutable source of information? Because if I'm giving you an audit trail that's fabricated, it doesn't really do me much good as an auditor to pass your audit if the information is fabricated. So we need proof of that typically from an auditing perspective. Now, going through those questions kind of a little bit more detailed, the challenge with the first question is you have to know, like I said, where that sensitive data is in order to report on who is accessing it. So that's usually some type of discovery, and really you've got thousands of different applications that are out there. You've got tons of different regulatory requirements. In most cases, you want to kind of work with your compliance officer if you have one, or at least somebody that would have some additional insight in terms of really where is my sensitive data within the application. Now, we have a tool that we have as a free tool. It's called SQL Column Search, and we kind of tell our prospective customers and users that are interested in that question that they can go download it, and what it's going to do is it's going to basically look for the information within the database that's going to be likely sensitive in nature. And then once you do that, you also have to understand how people are accessing that data. And that's going to be, once again, which accounts are within which Active Directory groups, which database users are involved, is there role memberships associated to this, and keeping in mind, of course, that all of these things that we're talking about have to be approved by the auditor. So if you say, this is how we're locking down the data, then the auditor can come back and say, well, you're doing it wrong. But let's say that they say, yeah, that looks good. You're locking down the data sufficiently. Moving on to the next question, which is going to be, can you prove that the right people are accessing that data? In other words, you can tell them your controls are, this is the controls you're following, but unfortunately the auditors are not real trusting individuals. They want proof of it, and they want to be able to see it within the audit trail. And this goes back to that whole common denominator thing, whether it's PCI, SOX, HIPAA, GLBA, Basel II, whatever. The reality is that the same types of questions are going to be typically asked. The object with the sensitive information, who has accessed that object within the last month? That should map up to my controls, and I should be able to pass my audit eventually by showing those types of reports. And so what we've done is we've compiled about 25 different reports that follow along those same kind of areas as that common denominator. So we don't have a report for PCI or for HIPAA or for SOX. We have reports that, once again, they go up against that common denominator. And so it doesn't really matter what regulatory requirement you're trying to fulfill. In most cases, you're going to be able to answer whatever question is posed to you by that auditor. And they're going to tell you, who, what, when, and where of every transaction. The user, the time the transaction occurred, the SQL statement itself, the application that it came from, all that good stuff. And then also be able to automate the delivery of this information through reports. And then once again, once you get past that and you've provided that to the auditor, then the next question is going to be prove it. And when I say prove it, I mean prove that the audit trail itself is something we can trust. And the way we do that in our tool is we have hash values and CRC values that tie directly back to the events themselves within the audit trail. And so then the idea is that if somebody goes out and deletes a record, or if somebody goes out and removes or adds something to the audit trail or changes something in the audit trail itself, we can prove that data was, the integrity of the data itself was violated. And so 99.9% of the time, if you've got our audit trail database locked down, you won't run into that problem, because when we run that integrity check, we're essentially proving to the auditor that the data itself hasn't been changed, deleted, or added to since the original writing from the management service itself. So that's kind of a general kind of overview of the typical kinds of questions that you'd be asked. Now, the tool that we have to address a lot of this is called SQL Compliance Manager, and it does all of those things in terms of tracking the transactions, the who, what, when, and where of the transactions, being able to do that in a number of different areas as well: logins, failed logins, schema changes, obviously data access, select activity, all those things that are happening within the database engine. And we're also being able to alert the users of specific, very granular conditions if need be. For example, somebody's going out and actually viewing the table that contains all my credit card numbers. They're not changing the data, they're just looking at it. In that situation, I can alert and I can let folks know that that's happening, not 6 hours later when we're scraping logs, but in real time, is basically as long as it takes for us to process that transaction through our management service. As I mentioned before, we've seen this used in a variety of different regulatory requirements, and it doesn't really, there's no any regulatory requirement. Once again, as long as the common denominator, you have sensitive data in a SQL Server database, this is a tool that would help in that type of situation through the 25 reports that are built in. Now, the reality is that we can make this tool, good for the auditor and answers every single question that they ask, but the DBAs are the ones that have to make it work. So there's also that thinking of, well, from a maintenance perspective, we have to make sure that the tool is working the way we want. We also have to be able to go in and look at the things that are going to be able to go out and look at other pieces of information, as far as the, archiving of the data, the automation of that, and the overhead itself of the product. Those are things that we obviously take into account, and which brings up the architecture itself. So on the very right side of the screen, we've got the instances of SQL that we manage, everything from 2000 all the way up to 2014, getting ready to release a version for 2016. The biggest takeaway on this screen is that the management server itself is doing all the heavy lifting. We're just collecting the data using the Trace API built in with SQL Server. That information is trickling up to our management server. That management server itself is identifying and if there are any events tied to any types of transactions that we don't want, sending out alerts and those kinds of things, and then populating the data within a repository. From there, we can run reports. We would be able to go out and actually see that information in the reports or even within the applications console. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I want to take us through real quickly, and I just want to point out one quick thing before we jump into the product. There's a link on the website right now or on the presentation that's going to take you to that free tool I mentioned earlier. That free tool is, like I said, it's going to go out and look at a database and try to find the areas that look like sensitive data, social security numbers, credit card numbers, based on the namings of the columns or the tables or based on the way that the format of the data looks, and you can customize that as well. So just point that out. Now, in our case, let me go ahead and share out my screen. Give me 1 second here. All right, and so what I want to take you to first is I want to take you to the Compliance Manager application itself, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But this is the application, and you can see I've got a couple of databases here, and I'm just going to show you how easy it is to go in and tell it what you're looking to audit. So from a standpoint of schema changes, security changes, administrative activities, DML, select, we have all those options available to us. We can also filter that down. So this goes back to the best practice of being able to say, I really only need this table because it's containing my credit card numbers. I don't need the other tables that have product information, all those other things that aren't relative to the level of compliance I'm trying to meet. We have also the ability to capture data and show it in terms of the values of the fields that are changing. So in a lot of tools, you'll have something that will give you the ability to capture the SQL statement, show the user, show the application, the time and date, all that good stuff. But in some cases, the SQL statement itself isn't going to give you enough information to be able to tell you what the value of the field was before the change occurred as well as the value of the field after the change occurred. And in some situations, you need that. I might want to track, for example, a doctor's dosage information for prescription drugs. It went from 50 milligrams to 80 milligrams to 120 milligrams. I would be able to track that using the before and after. Sensitive columns is another thing that we run into a lot, for example, with PCI compliance. In this situation here, you've got data that is so sensitive in nature that just by looking at that information, I don't have to change it, delete it, or add to it, I can cause irreparable harm. Credit card numbers, social security numbers, all that kind of good stuff we can identify as sensitive columns and tie alerts to it. So if anybody goes out and looks at that information, we would be able to obviously alert and send you an email or generate an SNMP trap and those kinds of things. Now, in some cases, you're going to run into a situation where you might have an exception. And what I mean by that, you have a situation where you have a user that as a user account that might be tied to some type of ETL job that runs in the middle of the night. It's a documented process, and I just simply do not need to include that transactional information for that user account. In that case, we would have a trusted user. And then in other situations, we would use the feature of privileged user auditing, which is essentially if I've got, let's say, for example, an application, and that application is already doing auditing of the users that are going through the application, that's great. I already have something to reference in terms of my audit. But the things that are tied to, for example, my privileged users, the guys that can go into SQL Server Management Studio to look at the data within the database, that's not going to cut it. And so this is where we could define who our privileged users are, either through role memberships or through their Active Directory accounts, groups, their SQL authenticated accounts. We would be able to choose all of those different types of options, and then from there make sure that for those privileged users we could specify the types of transactions we're interested in auditing. So these are all kind of different options that you have, and I'm not going to go through all of the different types of things based on the time constraints here for this presentation, but I do want to show you how we can view the data, and I think you'll like how this works, because there's two ways we can do it. I can do it interactively, and so when we talk to people that are interested in this tool for maybe their own internal controls, they just want to know what's going on in a lot of cases. They don't necessarily have auditors coming on site. They just want to know, hey, I want to go out to this table and see who's touched it in the last week or last month or whatever it might be. In this case, you can see how quickly we can do that. In the case of the healthcare database, I've got a table called patient records. In that table, if I were to just group by object, we can very quickly start to narrow where we're looking for. Maybe I want to group by category, and then maybe by event. And when I do that, you can see how quickly that shows up. And there's my patient records table right there. And as I drill in, we can now see the DML activity. We can see that we've had 1,000 inserts of DML. And when we open up one of these transactions, we can see the relevant information, the who, the what, the when, the where of the transaction, the SQL statement, obviously, the actual application being used to perform the transaction, the account, the time, and the date. Now, if you look at the next tab over here, the details tab, this goes back to that third question we're talking about, proving that the data the integrity of the data has not been breached. So basically every event we have a secret calculation for our hash value, and this is going to then tie back to when we do our integrity check. So for example, if I were to go out to the tool, go into the auditing menu, and I were to go out and say, let's check the repository integrity, I could point to the database where the audit trail is. It'll run through an integrity check matching up those hash values and CRC values to the actual events, and it's going to tell us that there have been no problems found. In other words, the data in the audit trail hasn't been tampered with since it was originally written by the management service. So that's obviously one way to interact with the data. The other way would be through the reports themselves. And so I'm just going to give you one quick example of a report. And once again, these reports, the way we came up with them, are not specific to any type of standard like PCI, HIPAA, SOX, or anything like that. Once again, it's the common denominator of what we're doing. And in this case, if we're going back to that patient records example, we would be able to go out and say, in our case here, we're looking at the healthcare database, and in our case, we want to focus specifically on that table that we know contains private information, in our case, related to our patients. And so let me see if I can type it here, and we're going to go ahead and run that report. And we're going to see then, obviously, from there, all of the relevant the data associated to that object. And in our case, it's showing us for a month's period of time, but we could go back 6 months, a year, however long we've been keeping the data for. So those are the kind of ways in which you would be able to actually prove, if you will, to the auditor that you're following your controls. Once you've identified that, then obviously that's a good thing in terms of passing your audit and being able to show that you're following your controls and everything's working. The last thing to kind of talk about that I wanted to demonstrate is in the administration section. There's also controls from the standpoint of, within this tool itself, being able to set controls to be able to make sure that if somebody is doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, that I can be made aware of it. And I'll give you a couple of examples there. I've got a login account that's tied to a service, and that service needs elevated permissions to do what it does. What I don't want is somebody going in and using that account in Management Studio and then using it for things that it was not intended for. So we would have two pieces of criteria here that we could apply. I could say, look, we're really interested in this working, let's say, with our PeopleSoft application, just as an example, okay? And so now that I've done that, what I'm saying here is I'm curious to know any logins that are tied to the account I'm getting ready to specify. If the application that's being used to log in with this account is not PeopleSoft, then that's going to be a raise for the alarm. And obviously, we have to specify the account name itself. So in our case, let's just call this priv account for the fact that it's privileged. Now, once we've done that, when we do this here, now we would be able to then specify what we would want to have happen when that occurs. And for each and every type of event, or I should say alert, you can have a separate notification to the person that's responsible for that particular piece of data. For example, if it's salary information, it might go to my director of HR. In this case, dealing with the PeopleSoft application is going to be the administrator of that application, whatever the case may be. So I would be able to put in my email address, customize the actual alert message, and all that kind of good stuff. So once again, this goes all back to being able to make sure that you can show that you're following your controls and that those controls are working the way that they are intended. From the last perspective here, just in terms of maintenance, we do have the ability to take this data and put it offline. I can archive the data and I can schedule it out, and we would be able to kind of do these things very easily, in the sense that you would actually be able to, as a DBA that's using this tool, set it up and kind of walk away from it. There's not a lot of hand-holding that will take place once you have it set up the way it should be. Like I said, the hardest part about any of this, I think, is not setting up what you want to audit. It's knowing what you want to set up to audit. And, you know, like I said, the nature of the beast with auditing, you have to keep the data for 7 years, so it only makes sense to focus in those areas that are sensitive in nature. But if you want to go the approach of collecting everything, you absolutely can. It's just not considered a best practice. So from that standpoint, I'd like to just remind folks that if this is something that is of interest, you can go out to the website at IDERA, idera.com, and download a trial of this and play around with it yourself. In terms of the free tool that we talked about earlier, well, it's free. You can go download it and use it forever, irregardless of whether you're using the Compliance Manager product. And the cool thing about that column search tool is that our findings that you come up with, and I can actually show that, I think, is that you will be able to export that data out and then be able to import it into Compliance Manager as well. I don't see it. I know it's here. There it is. So this is just an example of that. So this is where it's finding the related sensitive data. Now this is, in this case, I've gone out and I've really, I'm having it look up at everything, but you have just a ton of stuff that we can check for: credit card numbers, addresses, names, all that kind of stuff, and we'll identify where it is in the database, and then from there you can make the decision as to whether or not you actually want to audit that information. But it's definitely a way to make it a lot easier for you to define your scope of auditing when you're looking at a tool like this. And so I just would go ahead and close with that, and I will go ahead and pass it back to Eric.
That's a fantastic presentation. I love the way you really get into the gritty details there and show us what's going on, and because at the end of the day, there is some system that's going to access some record that's going to give you a report that's going to let you to tell your story, whether that be to a regulator, an auditor, or someone on your team, such that you know you're prepared if and when, or as and when, that person comes knocking. And of course, that's the unpleasant situation that you're trying to avoid. But if it happens, and it probably will happen these days, you want to be sure you have your I's dotted and your T's crossed. There's a good question from an audience member I want to throw out to perhaps you first, Bullett, and then if either presenter wants to comment on it, feel free, and then maybe Des ask a question and Robin. So the question is it fair to say that to do all those things that you have mentioned, you need to start an effort of data classification at an elementary level? You need to know your data when it emerges as a valuable potential asset and do something about that. Is that, I think you'd agree, Bullett, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got to know your data, and I realize and recognize that there's a lot of applications that are out there, and there's a lot of different things that are kind of moving parts in your organization. The column search tool is very helpful in terms of going a step to the direction of understanding that data better. But yes, it is very important. I mean, you do have the option of going approach of, you know, the fire hose approach and auditing everything, but it's just a lot more challenging that way logistically when you talk about having to store that data and report against that data. And then you still kind of need to know where that sensitive data is, because when you run your reports, you're going to need to show your auditors that information as well. So I think that, like I said, the biggest challenge when I talk to database administrators is knowing data. Yeah.
Yep, and maybe, Robin, I'll bring you in real quick. It seems to be the 80-20 rule applies here, right? You're probably not going to find every system of record that matters if you're in some mid-sized or large organization, but if you focus on, like Bullett was suggesting here, PeopleSoft, for example, or other systems of record that are predominant in the enterprise, that's where you focus 80% of your effort, and then 20% is on the other systems that may be out there somewhere, right?
Well, I'm sure, yeah. I mean, you know, I think the problem with this, technology, and I think it's probably worth having a comment on it. But the problem with this technology is, how do you implement it? I mean, there is very definitely a lack of knowledge, let's say, in most organizations as to even the number of databases that are out there. You know, there's an awful lot of lack of inventory, let's say. So, you know, the question is, let's imagine that we're starting in a situation where there isn't particularly well-managed compliance. How do you take this technology and inject it into the environment, not just in, you know, technology terms, setting stuff up, but like who manages it, who determines what? How do you start to shoehorn this into a genuine doing its job kind of thing?
Well, I mean, you know, that's a good question. The challenge in a lot of cases is that, I mean, you have to kind of start asking the questions right at the very beginning. I've run into a lot of companies where they, you know, maybe they're a private company and they got acquired. There is an initial first road bump, if you want to call it that. For example, if I've just now become a publicly traded company because of acquisition, I'm going to have to go back and probably figure some stuff out. And in some cases, we talk to organizations that, you know, they actually, even though they're private, they follow SOX compliance rules simply because in the event that they do want to get acquired, they know that they're going to be in compliance. You definitely don't want to take the approach of just, you know, I don't need to worry about this now. Any type of regulatory compliant like PCI or SOX or whatever, you know, you want to make the investment of doing the research or the understanding of where that sensitive information is. Otherwise, you might be finding yourself, you know, dealing with some significant hefty fines, and you know, it's a lot better just to invest that time, you know, finding that data and being able to report against it and show the controls are working. You know, in terms of setting it up, like I said, the first thing I would recommend to folks that are getting ready to face an audit is to just go out and do a cursory examination of the database, figuring out, you know, in their best efforts trying to figure out where that sensitive data is. And the other approach would be to start with maybe a larger net in terms of what the scope of auditing is, and then slowly, you know, curve your way down once you kind of figure out where those areas within the schema are that are related to the sensitive information. But I wish I could tell you there's an easy answer to that question. It's going to probably vary quite a bit from one organization to the other, and the type of compliance, and really how you know, how much structure they have within their applications, and how many diverse applications they have. Some of them will be custom written applications. So it's gonna depend on the situation in a lot of cases.
Yeah, Des, I'm sure you've got a question or two.
Yeah, I'm keen to just get some insight into your observations around the impact to the organizations from a people point of view, actually. I think one of the areas where I see the greatest value for this particular solution is that when people wake up in the morning and go to work, at various levels of the organization, they wake up with a series of, or a chain of responsibility that they've got to deal with. And I'm keen to get some insight into what you are seeing out there with and without the types of tools you're talking about. And the context I'm talking about here is from the chairperson at the board level to the CEO and CIO and the C-suite, and now we've got chief risk officers who are thinking more about the types of things we're talking about here in compliance and governance. And then we've now got new roles like chief data officer, who's you know, even more concerned about it. And on the side of each of them, around the CIO, we've got IT managers on one side with sort of, you know, technical leads, and then database leads. In the operations space, we've got development managers and development leads, and then individual developers. And they also loop back into the database administration layer. What are you seeing around the reaction of each of these different parts of the business to the challenge of compliance and regulatory reporting, and their approach to it? Are you seeing that people are coming at this with a fervor and can see the benefit to it, or are you seeing that they're reluctantly dragging their feet to this thing and just, you know, doing it for a tick in the box? And what are the kinds of responses you're seeing once they see your software?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that this is certainly, this product, the sales of this product are mostly driven by somebody's in the hot seat, if that makes sense. So in most cases, that's the DBA from our perspective. In other words, they know that there's an audit coming up, and they are going to be responsible, because they are the DBAs, to be able to provide the information that the auditor is going to ask. They can do that by writing their own reports and creating their own custom traces and all those kinds of things. The reality is that they don't want to do that. In most cases, DBAs aren't really looking forward to having those conversations with the auditor to begin with. So, you know, I would love to tell you that we can go call upon a company and say, hey, this is a great tool, and you're going to love it, and show them all the features, and they'll buy it. The reality is that they're typically not going to be looking at this tool unless they are actually going to be faced with an audit, or the other side of that coin is they have had an audit and failed it miserably, and now they are being told to get some help, or they're going to be fined. So I would say that in terms of, you know, general overall, when we show this product to folks, they definitely see the value of it, because it does save them a ton of time in terms of having to figure out what they want to report on, those kinds of things. All those reports are already built in. The alerting mechanisms are in place. And then, once again, the third question is also, in a lot of cases, can be a challenge, because I can show you reports all day long, but unless you can prove to me that those reports are actually valid, then, you know, it's a lot tougher proposition for me as a DBA to be able to show that. Well, we've worked out the technology and the hashing techniques and all those kinds of things to be able to help make sure that the data and its integrity of the audit trails is being kept. And so, you know, those are the things that, those are my observations in terms of most of the people we talk to. You know, there's definitely, in different organizations, you know, like you'll hear about, you know, like Target, for example, had a data breach. And, you know, I mean, when other organizations hear about the fines and those kinds of things, it raises an eyebrow. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine some DBAs when they finally see what can be done with the tool. I've just realized they've gotten their late nights and weekends back as well. Time and cost reductions, another thing I'm seeing when the appropriate tools are applied to this whole problem, and that is that 3 weeks ago I sat with a bank here in Australia, a global bank, a top 3 bank. They're massive, and they had a project where they had to report on their wealth management compliance and particularly risk, and they were looking at 60 weeks worth of work for a couple hundred human beings. And when they were shown the likes of a tool like yourself that could just automate the process, the sense, the look on their faces when they realized they didn't have to spend X number of weeks with hundreds of people doing a manual process was kind of like they'd found God. But the challenging thing then was how to actually put it into play. And as Dr. Bloor indicated, you know, this is something that becomes a mixture of behavioral and cultural shift. What, at the levels that you're dealing with, who are dealing with this directly at the application level, what kind of change do you see when they start adopting a tool to do the kind of reporting and auditing and controls that you can offer as opposed to what they might have done manually? What does that look like when they actually put it into practice?
Are you asking what's the difference in terms of how to do this manually versus using this tool? Is that the question?
Well, specifically the impact to the business. Like, you know, for example, if we're trying to deliver compliance in a manual process, you know, we invariably take a long time, a lot of human beings. But I guess to put some context around the question, like, you know, are we talking about a single person running this tool replacing potentially 50 people and being able to do the same thing in real time or in hours versus months? Is that kind of, what does that generally turn out to be?
Well, I mean, it comes down to a couple things. One is having the ability to answer those questions. Some of those things aren't going to be done very easily. So, yeah, the time it takes to do this stuff homegrown, to write the reports on your own, to set up the traces or the extended events to gather the data manually could take a lot of time. Really, I'll give you something. I mean, this doesn't really relate to data in general, but like right after the Enron happened and SOX became prevalent, I was at one of the larger oil companies in Houston, and we counted for, I think it was like 25% of our business costs were related to SOX compliance and being in. Now that was right after, and that was kind of the initial first step at SOX. But the same would, I mean, I'd say, you know, you get a lot of benefit by using this tool in the sense that you don't have, it doesn't require a lot of people to do this and a lot of different type of people to do it. And like I said, the DBA is not typically the guy it's really looking forward to having those conversations with the auditor. So in a lot of cases, what we'll see is the DBA can offload this and be able to provide the reporting interface to the auditor, and they can remove themselves completely out of the equation rather than having to be involved. So that's a tremendous savings as well in terms of resource when you can do that.
Yeah,
so they're talking about massive cost reductions, right? These organizations not only remove the risk and the overhead of it, but I mean, essentially talking about a significant reduction in cost, A, operationally, and also B, in the fact that, if they can actually provide real-time compliance reporting, that there's a significantly reduced risk of data breach or some legal fine or impact for not being compliant, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, for not being compliant, there's all kinds of bad things that happen from that. So there's the carrot and the stick approach, right? They can use this tool and it would be great, or they don't, and they'll find out how bad it really is. So yeah, I mean, it's not the tool, obviously. You can do your checks and everything without a tool like this. Like you said, it's just going to take a lot more time and cost.
That's great. So, Eric, I'm going to pass back to you because I think the takeaway for me is that time to market is fantastic, but also essentially this thing's worth its weight in gold on the basis that being able to avoid the commercial impact of an issue taking place, or being able to reduce the time it takes to report and manage compliance just makes it the tool pays for itself immediately by the sounds of things.
That's exactly right. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Bullett. Thanks to all of you out there for your time and attention, Robin and Des. Another great presentation today. Thanks to our friends at IDERA for letting us bring you this content free of charge. We will archive this webcast for later viewing. The archive is usually up within about a day. And let us know what you think about our new website, insideanalysis.com. A whole new design, a whole new look and feel. We'd love to hear your feedback. And with that, I'm going to bid you farewell, folks. You can email me, info@insideanalysis.com. Otherwise, we'll catch up to you next week. We've got 7 webcasts in the next 5 weeks or something like that. We're going to be busy, and we'll be at the Strata Conference and the IBM Analyst Summit in New York later this month. So if you're around there, stop by and say hello. Take care, folks. Bye-bye. All right.